The sun hung low over the dusty expanse of Redemption Valley, casting long shadows across the weathered faces of three figures standing at the edge of what had once been a thriving settlement.
This land has a story to
The wind
tell,
carried with
if
it
you're
the
willing
scent
to
of
listen.
sagebrush and the distant memory of gunpowder, a reminder that in this corner of the frontier, death was never more than a heartbeat away. Yet for Samuel Steele Morrison, death had become something far more complex than a simple end. It had become a teacher, a forge, and, ultimately, a doorway to understanding the fundamental truth that would reshape not only his own destiny but the lives of the two women who now stood beside him with unwavering loyalty. The transformation had not begun with heroics or grand gestures. Like most profound changes in the unforgiving landscape of the American West, it had started with failure, with weakness, and with the kind of desperate moment that strips a man down to his most essential self. Samuel Morrison had been, by all accounts, a man defined by his limitations. Standing barely 5 feet 8 inches in a land where size often determined survival, possessed of hands that shook when faced with violence, and cursed with a stutter that made him the target of every saloon bully from Kansas City to San Francisco, he had spent the first 28 years of his life running from confrontation rather than facing it. The irony was not lost on him that the very qualities which had made him appear weak to others, his reluctance to fight, his preference for words over violence, his instinctive desire to help rather than harm, would eventually become the foundation of a strength that no bullet could penetrate and no enemy could destroy. But that understanding lay months in the future, beyond a crucible of fire and blood that would first strip away every pretense, every comfortable lie he had told himself about who he was and what he was capable of becoming. The story truly began on a scorching Tuesday in late August, when the Morrison family's small ranch outside the settlement of Bitter Creek became the target of the Vance brothers, a gang of cattle rustlers and murderers whose reputation stretched across 3 territories. Samuel had been in town that morning, attempting to secure a loan to keep the ranch operational through another difficult winter, when the sound of gunfire echoing across the valley sent him racing home on his aging horse, Patience. What he found there would haunt him for months to come: his father's body sprawled in the yard, his mother collapsed beside the burning barn, and his 2 younger sisters nowhere to be found. The weakness that had defined him for so long manifested in that moment as a complete paralysis of will. While the barn continued to burn and the horses screamed in their terror, Samuel stood frozen, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his father's rifle. The stutter that had plagued him since childhood rendered him unable even to call out for his sisters. In that moment of absolute crisis, when action was required above all else, he discovered that the gentle nature his mother had always praised in him had left him utterly unprepared for the brutal realities of frontier justice. It was old Pete Grayson, a neighboring rancher who had seen the smoke, who found Samuel 3 hours later, still standing in the same spot, still clutching the rifle with useless hands. Pete's weathered face showed no surprise at the scene. He had lived through the Indian Wars and seen what men could do to each other when civilization's thin veneer was stripped away. But what did surprise him was the look in Samuel's eyes, not the blank stare of shock he had expected, but something far more dangerous: the cold, calculating gaze of a man taking inventory of his failures and making a list of necessary changes. "Your sisters," Pete said without preamble, because in a land where words were as precious as water, there was no point in wasting them on comfort that wouldn't change anything. The Vance brothers took them. Headed east toward the Badlands. Trails already 6 hours cold. The words hit Samuel like physical blows, each one highlighting another aspect of his inadequacy. He was not a tracker, he had left such skills to his father. He was not a gunfighter, his hands still shook at the thought of violence. He was not a horseman capable of crossing the treacherous Badlands, he had never traveled more than 20 miles from the ranch. Every rational assessment of the situation led to the same conclusion: his sisters were lost, and he was powerless to save them. Yet something had changed in those 3 hours of standing over his parents' bodies. The weakness that had paralyzed him was transforming into something else, something harder and more purposeful. The man who had spent his life avoiding conflict was beginning to understand that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost to himself or the likelihood of success. The comfortable illusions that had sustained him, that the world was fundamentally fair, that gentleness was always a virtue, that someone else would handle the difficult decisions, had been burned away as thoroughly as the family barn. Pete Grayson, who had known Samuel since childhood, recognized the change immediately. The boy who had once hidden behind his mother's skirts when other children teased him was gone, replaced by something harder and more focused. When Samuel spoke, the stutter was still there, but underneath it was a steel determination that Pete had never heard before. "I need supplies," Samuel said, his voice quiet but clear. "Food for a week, ammunition, and whatever you know about tracking in the Badlands." Pete studied the younger man's face, looking for signs of the hysteria or desperation that typically followed such tragedies. Instead, he saw only a cold assessment of resources and requirements. "Son," he said carefully, "those men are killers. Professional ones. You're a rancher who's never fired a shot in anger. This isn't something you walk away from. I'm not planning to walk away from it." The simple statement carried a weight that made Pete reconsider everything he thought he knew about Samuel Morrison. The weakness was still there, in the slight tremor of his hands, in the way he had to concentrate to keep the stutter out of his voice, but it was now serving a different purpose. Instead of being a limitation, it had become a measurement, a baseline against which to gauge progress. Every moment of fear conquered, every instinctive retreat overcome, every comfortable assumption discarded, brought him one step closer to becoming the man his sisters needed him to be. The transformation was not magic. It was not the sudden flowering of hidden strength or the emergence of some heroic destiny that had always been waiting to be revealed. Instead, it was the methodical, painful process of destroying every aspect of himself that served no purpose in the task ahead. The gentle nature that had made him beloved by his family became a liability that had to be managed. The reluctance to cause harm that had made him a good neighbor became an obstacle that had to be overcome. The desire for safety and comfort that had kept him close to home became a weakness that had to be eliminated entirely. Under Pete Grayson's reluctant guidance, Samuel began the process of rebuilding himself from the ground up. The first lesson was the hardest, learning to see violence not as an evil to be avoided, but as a tool to be mastered. Pete, who had killed 12 men in defense of his own family and property, understood the psychological shift required better than most. Violence, he explained as they practiced with rifle and pistol in the fading light of that first evening, was neither good nor evil in itself, it was simply the application of force in service of will. The moral weight came not from the action, but from the purpose behind it. "A man who won't fight when fighting's called for," Pete said as Samuel's hands shook while attempting to reload a revolver, "is just as useless as a man who fights when talking would serve better. The trick is knowing the difference and having the tools for both." The physical training was only the beginning. More challenging was the mental discipline required to overcome a lifetime of conditioning that had taught him to seek compromise, to assume good intentions, and to trust in the fundamental decency of other human beings. The Badlands where the Vance brothers had taken his sisters were a place where such assumptions would be not merely useless but actively dangerous. Survival there would require the ability to think like a predator, to anticipate violence before it occurred, and to respond to threats with immediate and overwhelming force. Night after night, as Samuel practiced drawing and firing until his hands bled and his shoulders ached, Pete shared the hard-earned wisdom of a man who had survived decades on a frontier where the strong preyed on the weak without mercy or hesitation. The stories were not heroic tales of noble gunfighters defending the innocent, but brutal accounts of men and women who had learned to recognize the moment when civilization's rules no longer applied and who had developed the skills and mentality necessary to survive in such moments. The Vance brothers, Pete explained on the third night, as Samuel finally managed to draw and fire without his hands shaking, they're not just killers. They're smart killers. They know these Badlands better than any lawman, and they've got hideouts scattered across 200 square miles of the meanest country God ever made. They're expecting pursuit, but they're not expecting it from you. Because I'm weak. Because you were weak, Pete corrected. But weakness ain't a permanent condition unless a man chooses to make it one. The question is whether you're willing to pay the price to change it. The price, as Samuel was beginning to understand, was nothing less than everything he had been. The gentle rancher who had never raised his hand in anger would have to die for the man who could save his sisters to be born. The comfortable assumptions about justice and fairness would have to be abandoned in favor of a clearer understanding of what actually worked in a world without law. The reluctance to cause harm would have to be transformed into the willingness to do whatever was necessary, regardless of the cost to his own moral comfort. On the fourth morning, as Samuel saddled his horse and prepared to ride into the Badlands alone, Pete made one final observation that would prove prophetic. "You're still weak," he said, watching Samuel check his weapons with hands that no longer shook. But, you're weak in new ways now, and that makes you dangerous. The Vance brothers are expecting to deal with the kind of man you used to be. They're not ready for the kind of man you're becoming. The transformation that had begun with the destruction of his family was far from complete as Samuel rode east into the rising sun. The scared, stuttering rancher was still there, still fighting to reassert control every time violence became necessary. But something harder and more focused had taken root alongside the fear, something that measured every decision against a single standard. Would it bring him closer to his sisters or further from them? Everything else, comfort, safety, moral certainty, the good opinion of others, had become secondary considerations. The Badlands stretched before him like a vast examination, each mile testing his resolve, each shadow potentially concealing the enemies he sought. The weakness that had once defined him was still there, still requiring constant vigilance and management. But it was no longer the weakness of ignorance or inexperience. It had become the weakness of a man who understood exactly what he was risking and had chosen to risk it anyway, because some things mattered more than personal survival. Behind him, the smoke from his family's ranch had finally dissipated, leaving only the memory of what had been lost and the promise of what might yet be saved. Ahead lay the Badlands and the Vance brothers, professional killers who had never faced an opponent willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of two young women they had dismissed as merely another form of plunder. The man riding toward them was still weak in many ways, still fighting the instincts and assumptions of a lifetime. But he was no longer the man they had expected to pursue them, and that difference would prove more dangerous than all the conventional strength in the world. As the sun climbed higher and the familiar landmarks of home disappeared behind him, Samuel Morrison began to understand the truth that would carry him through the trials ahead. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has already faced and conquered his greatest enemy. The Vance brothers had killed his parents and stolen his sisters, but, in doing so, they had also freed him from the limitations that had kept him weak. What emerged from that destruction would be something they had never encountered before, a man with nothing left to lose and everything necessary to win. Part 2, The Forge of the Badlands. The Badlands revealed their secrets grudgingly, like an old gambler protecting his cards. What had seemed from a distance to be an endless expanse of sun-bleached rock and scrub brush proved upon closer inspection to be a labyrinth of hidden canyons, underground springs, and natural fortifications that had sheltered outlaws and renegades for generations. Samuel's pursuit of the Vance brothers became an education in survival that no classroom could have provided, each day stripping away another layer of civilized assumptions until only the most essential truths remained. The trail was easier to follow than Pete Grayson had predicted, not because the Vance brothers were careless, but because they were confident. The hoofprints of 6 horses, 2 carrying double weight, led steadily east through terrain that became increasingly hostile with each passing mile. Samuel learned to read the story written in disturbed earth and broken vegetation. Here the group had stopped to rest, there one of the horses had stumbled, at this spot someone had dismounted to adjust a saddle or tend to a lame animal. Most importantly, he learned to recognize the signs that his sisters were still alive, footprints too small to belong to the outlaws, indicating they had been allowed to walk during rest stops. The physical challenges of the pursuit were manageable compared to the psychological warfare that accompanied it. The Vance brothers were not simply fleeing, they were leading him deeper into country they knew intimately, testing his resolve and his capabilities with each mile. Water sources became scarcer and more difficult to locate. The few trails that existed led through natural choke points perfect for ambush. Most insidiously, they began leaving signs specifically intended to demoralize him: a torn piece of his sister Margaret's dress tied to a thorn bush, a few strands of younger sister Catherine's blonde hair caught on a rock outcropping. The old Samuel Morrison, the rancher who had spent his life avoiding conflict, would have been paralyzed by the psychological pressure. But the man who had emerged from the ashes of his family's ranch understood that such tactics revealed more about his enemies than they did about his situation. The Vance brothers were trying to break his spirit because they recognized that his pursuit was more determined than they had anticipated. They were investing time and effort in psychological warfare because they could not simply outrun him as they had expected. Most tellingly, they were keeping his sisters alive and relatively unharmed because they understood that dead hostages would transform his pursuit from a rescue mission into a vengeance quest that would never end. On the 6th day of pursuit, as Samuel watered his horse at a hidden spring that showed clear signs of recent use, he encountered the first of the obstacles the Vance brothers had prepared for him. 3 men emerged from concealment among the rocks above the spring, their weapons drawn but not immediately threatening. They were not members of the main gang, Samuel realized, but local hardcases hired to discourage pursuit. The conversation that followed would have been impossible for the man he had been a week earlier. "You're Samuel Morrison," said the apparent leader, a thin man with the scarred hands of someone who had spent years working with dangerous animals. "We've been paid to give you some advice." Samuel continued watering his horse, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The fear was still there, would always be there, but it had been transformed from a paralyzing force into a source of heightened awareness. Every detail of the situation registered with crystal clarity: the way the leftmost gunman favored his right leg, suggesting an old injury, the nervous habit the leader had of touching his gun but when he spoke, the fact that all 3 men were positioned to cover each other but were also trapped in their current positions by the rocky terrain. "I'm listening," Samuel said, his voice carrying none of the stutter that had plagued him since childhood. The weeks of training with Pete Grayson had taught him that confidence was often more important than competence, and that the appearance of calm could be as effective as genuine fearlessness. "The Vance brothers want you to know that your sisters are alive and, well," the leader continued, clearly following a script he had been given. "They'll stay that way as long as you turn around and head home. Keep following, and things will get unpleasant for everyone involved." The threat was delivered matter-of-factly, without bluster or apparent malice. These men were professionals, Samuel realized, hired hands who would kill him if necessary but felt no personal animosity toward him. That understanding opened possibilities that would not have existed if they had been driven by hatred or bloodlust. Professional killers were predictable in ways that passionate ones were not. They responded to incentives, calculated risks and rewards, and generally preferred outcomes that did not require unnecessary violence. The Vance brothers sent 3 men to deliver a message they could have left written on a rock, Samuel observed, his tone conversational. "That suggests they're more concerned about my pursuit than they're willing to admit." The leader's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his features. He had been prepared for rage, desperation, or fear, the normal responses of a man whose family had been destroyed. He had not expected analysis or strategic thinking from a small-town rancher. "You're making a mistake," the leader said, but with less conviction than before. "You're 1 man against 6 experienced killers. Even if you could track them through country they know better than their own names, what exactly do you think you can accomplish?" "I think," Samuel replied, still not looking directly at any of the 3 men, "that the Vance brothers are discovering they've made an error in judgment. They expected to be pursued by the man I was a week ago. Instead, they're dealing with the man I'd become." The transformation he was describing was real but incomplete. The fear was still there, threatening to overwhelm him if he allowed it. The physical skills Pete Grayson had taught him were barely adequate for the challenges he was facing. Most of his apparent confidence was carefully constructed theater designed to conceal very real limitations. But the psychological shift was genuine. He had learned to think past his own survival to focus on objectives that mattered more than personal safety. "And what kind of man is that?" the leader asked, genuinely curious now. "The kind who has already died," Samuel answered. "Everything that could be taken from me has been taken. Everything I was afraid of losing is already gone. That makes me very dangerous to men who still have something to protect." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Samuel could have imagined participating in even a week earlier. The 3 hired guns found themselves dealing with someone who seemed to understand their profession better than they had expected, someone who spoke their language of calculated risk and professional necessity. Samuel offered them information they could take back to the Vance brothers: his real capabilities, his actual intentions, and the specific terms under which he might be willing to negotiate. In return, they provided details about the gang's plans, their destination, and the condition of his sisters. The negotiation was conducted in the matter-of-fact tone men use when discussing the price of livestock or the terms of a business contract. There was no appeal to morality or justice, no threats or bluster, simply a practical discussion of what each party could offer the other. Samuel learned that the Vance brothers were headed for a permanent hideout in the deepest part of the Badlands, a natural fortress that had never been successfully assaulted by law enforcement. His sisters were being kept alive as insurance, but their continued health depended on Samuel's willingness to be reasonable about the situation. When the conversation ended, both sides understood the situation more clearly. The three hired guns would report that Samuel Morrison was not the easy target they had anticipated, that he possessed a dangerous combination of determination and intelligence that made him unpredictable. Samuel, in turn, understood that he was walking into a trap that had been months in the planning, that the Vance brothers had prepared multiple fallback positions, and that his sister's survival depended entirely on his ability to offer them something more valuable than whatever they had originally planned to gain from the kidnapping. As the three men departed, the leader offered one final piece of advice: whatever you're planning, Morrison, remember that the Vance brothers didn't survive this long by being careless or sentimental. They've killed men better than you for less reason than you're giving them. I'm counting on that, Samuel replied, and meant it. The encounter marked a crucial turning point in his understanding of the situation. The Vance brothers were not simply running from him, they were drawing him deeper into their territory, testing his capabilities, and preparing to either eliminate him as a threat or recruit him as an asset. The psychological warfare was designed not merely to demoralize him but to evaluate his potential usefulness. Men who thought strategically rather than emotionally were rare on the frontier, and rarer still among those with legitimate grievances against the gang. Over the following days, as the trail led him deeper into increasingly hostile territory, Samuel began to encounter other signs of the Vance brothers' true intentions. Supply caches hidden in apparently random locations suggested a long-term plan rather than a simple escape route. Lookout posts positioned to monitor multiple approaches indicated they were expecting more than casual pursuit. Most significantly, several of the gang's traditional hideouts showed signs of recent abandonment, suggesting they were consolidating their operations in preparation for something larger than a simple kidnapping. The realization that he was walking into something far more complex than a rescue mission might have paralyzed the old Samuel Morrison. But the man who emerged from the ashes of his family's ranch found the information liberating rather than terrifying. Complex situations offered more opportunities than simple ones. If the Vance brothers were planning something that required them to remain in one location for an extended period, it meant they could not simply keep running indefinitely. If they were evaluating him as a potential asset rather than merely a threat to be eliminated, it meant his sister's survival was tied to his ability to prove his value rather than simply his willingness to withdraw. The Badlands themselves became an ally in ways Samuel had not anticipated. The harsh terrain that made pursuit difficult also made escape routes limited and predictable. The scarcity of water sources meant that even a group as experienced as the Vance brothers had to follow certain patterns of movement. Most importantly, the isolation that made the region perfect for hiding also meant that any confrontation would be private, without interference from law enforcement or well-meaning civilians who might complicate the situation. By the time Samuel reached the outer perimeter of the Vance brothers' final stronghold, 2 weeks after beginning his pursuit, he was no longer the same man who had stood paralyzed in his burning ranch yard. The physical changes were obvious: his hands no longer shook, his voice carried confidence instead of uncertainty, and his movements had acquired the deliberate efficiency of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it would be needed most. But the deeper transformation was psychological, a fundamental shift in how he understood himself and his place in the world. The weakness that had defined him for so long was still present, but it had been refined and purified until it served a different purpose. Instead of being a source of shame or limitation, it had become a tool for understanding others who shared similar vulnerabilities. The fear that had once paralyzed him now provided crucial information about threats and opportunities. The reluctance to cause harm that had made him seem cowardly was now tempered by a clearer understanding of when violence was truly necessary and when other approaches might be more effective. Most importantly, the comfortable illusions that had protected him from life's harsher realities had been replaced by a clear-eyed assessment of what was actually required to achieve his objectives. Saving his sisters would not be accomplished through heroic gestures or moral righteousness, but through careful planning, accurate intelligence, and the willingness to pay whatever price was demanded. The man who had begun this journey seeking to rescue 2 young women from outlaws had discovered that the real challenge was rescuing himself from a lifetime of assumptions that had rendered him ineffective when effectiveness was most needed. The fortress that housed the Vance brothers and his sisters lay hidden in a box canyon whose walls rose nearly vertical for 200 feet on 3 sides. The only approach was through a narrow defile that could be easily defended by a small number of men with rifles. traditional assault was impossible, negotiation was complicated by the gang's well-earned reputation for ruthlessness, and time was running out as supply shortages in the hideout would soon force some kind of resolution to the standoff. Standing in the concealment of rocks overlooking the canyon, Samuel Morrison considered his options with the cold calculation of a man who had learned to think past conventional limitations. The rancher who had spent his life avoiding difficult decisions was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the most dangerous battles were often won before the first shot was fired. The Vance brothers had chosen their ground carefully, but, in doing so, they had also trapped themselves in a position where their strengths could become weaknesses and their confidence could become vulnerability. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because destruction had become a tool rather than a threat. Everything Samuel Morrison had been was already gone, consumed in the fire of his family's ranch. What remained was something harder and more focused, something capable of thinking like his enemies while retaining the moral clarity that made victory meaningful rather than merely possible. As the sun set behind the canyon walls and the lights of the outlaw camp began to flicker in the gathering darkness, Samuel began to implement the plan that would either reunite him with his sisters or ensure that the Vance brothers would never harm another family. The choice between success and failure would ultimately depend not on strength or courage or superior firepower, but on his ability to offer his enemies something they wanted more than they feared what he might do to obtain it. The final phase of his transformation was about to begin. Part 3, The Stand of the Redeemed. The dawn mist that rose from the hidden springs in the Box Canyon created perfect cover for Samuel's final approach to the Vance brothers' stronghold. But concealment was not his primary objective as he descended into the narrow defile that led to the outlaw camp. 3 weeks of pursuit through the Badlands had taught him that victory over professional killers would not come through superior firepower or tactical surprise, it would come through understanding what they valued more than their own survival and making himself indispensable to obtaining it. The camp that emerged from the morning mist was more sophisticated than Samuel had anticipated. What he had expected to find was a temporary hideout, a crude collection of tents and fire pits where desperate men waited for pursuit to abandon the chase. Instead, he discovered a permanent settlement that had been years in the planning and construction. Adobe buildings with proper roofs lined the canyon walls. A blacksmith's forge sent smoke into the morning air. Corrals held more than 30 horses, far more than 6 men would require for simple transportation. Most significantly, the presence of women and children among the camp's inhabitants suggested that the Vance brothers had created something far more ambitious than a gang hideout. Samuel's sisters were visible almost immediately, helping with morning chores alongside other captives whose presence indicated that the Morrison kidnapping was only the most recent in a long series of similar operations. Margaret, now 18 and possessed of the same auburn hair that had been their mother's pride, was drawing water from the central well with movements that suggested weeks of familiar routine. Catherine, barely 16 but already showing the independence that had always worried their parents, was tending to horses in the main corral with the easy confidence of someone who had found purpose in useful work. Neither girl appeared to be mistreated, but neither appeared to be free to leave. They were assets being maintained in good condition, valuable primarily for their potential rather than any immediate utility. The realization that his sisters were part of a larger operation complicated Samuel's planning but also revealed opportunities that a simple rescue mission would not have offered. The voice that called out to him from the shadows near the canyon entrance was familiar from the descriptions Pete Grayson had provided. Marcus Vance, the eldest and most dangerous of the brothers, emerged into the morning light with the confident stride of a man on his own territory addressing an expected visitor. "Samuel Morrison," he said without preamble, his tone neither threatening nor welcoming. "You've led us quite a chase. Your sisters have been asking about you." The conversation that followed took place in the center of the camp, within sight of everyone present, including Margaret and Catherine. This was theater as much as negotiation, Samuel realized, a demonstration for the benefit of multiple audiences who needed to understand the new dynamics that were being established. Marcus Vance was not what Samuel had expected. Instead of the crude outlaw of frontier legend, he encountered a man who spoke with the educated accent of someone raised in circumstances far removed from the Badlands. His clothes were well-made, his manner courteous, and his questions demonstrated an intelligence that explained how a gang of 6 men had managed to maintain operations across 3 territories without being caught or killed by law enforcement. "You've impressed my people," Marcus continued, gesturing toward several men who had appeared from various buildings to observe the confrontation. 3 weeks ago, you were a rancher who'd never been more than 20 miles from home. Now you're standing in a place that took federal marshals 6 months to locate, and you walked in here like you were invited. I was invited, Samuel replied, understanding now that everything since the attack on his family's ranch had been orchestrated with this moment in mind. The question is whether you're prepared to honor the terms of that invitation. The negotiation that unfolded over the following hours was unlike anything Samuel could have imagined participating in even a month earlier. The Vance brothers, he learned, were not simply outlaws but businessmen operating outside the law because it offered advantages that legitimate enterprises could not provide. The Canyon settlement was the headquarters of an operation that included cattle rustling, protection services for other criminal enterprises, and the systematic kidnapping of individuals whose skills or connections made them valuable assets. Margaret and Catherine had been taken not simply for ransom or revenge, but because the gang's intelligence network had identified them as possessing qualities that made them useful for long-term purposes. Margaret's education and social graces made her valuable for operations requiring someone who could move in respectable society. Catherine's natural ability with horses and mechanical devices had applications in the increasingly complex logistics of criminal enterprise. Most importantly, both sisters had demonstrated the independence and resilience that made them suitable for the dangerous work of an outlaw organization. Samuel's pursuit had been anticipated and encouraged because the brothers recognized in him the same qualities they had identified in his sisters. A man who could transform himself from a timid rancher into someone capable of tracking professional killers through hostile territory was exactly the kind of asset their expanding operations required. The psychological warfare during his pursuit had been as much about testing his capabilities as it had been about discouraging him. Your parents were unfortunate casualties, Marcus explained with matter-of-fact honesty that was somehow more chilling than any threat could have been. But their deaths served a purpose beyond simple elimination of witnesses. They created the motivation necessary to transform you into the man you've become. The revelation that his family's destruction had been deliberate rather than random might have driven the old Samuel Morrison into a rage that would have ended the conversation in violence. But the man who had emerged from that destruction understood that rage was a luxury he could not afford while his sisters' lives hung in the balance. The anger was still there, would always be there, but it had been refined into something colder and more useful than simple desire for revenge. And what kind of man is that? Samuel asked, echoing the question posed by the hired guns at the spring. The kind who can think past his own moral comfort to focus on what actually needs to be accomplished, Marcus replied. The kind who understands that the world is divided between those who take what they need and those who wait for someone else to provide it. The kind who has learned that strength comes not from avoiding difficult choices but from making them regardless of the personal cost. The offer that followed was presented not as an ultimatum but as a business proposition between equals. Samuel could join the organization, bringing with him the skills and perspective that his transformation had provided. His sisters would become full members as well, their safety guaranteed by their usefulness and their family connections. The alternative was not death, that would be wasteful of valuable assets, but indefinite separation, with the sisters remaining in the canyon while Samuel was free to return to whatever remained of his old life. The choice was designed to be impossible in traditional terms. Joining the organization would mean abandoning everything he had believed about right and wrong, accepting responsibility for future crimes that would inevitably follow from association with the Vance brothers. Refusing would mean abandoning his sisters to a life outside the law, knowing that their survival depended on their continued usefulness to people who viewed human beings as resources to be managed rather than individuals to be respected. But Samuel Morrison was no longer thinking in traditional terms. The weeks in the Badlands had taught him that survival often required accepting choices that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. The moral certainties of his old life had been luxuries supported by the protection of law and social order. In their absence, different principles became necessary, not the abandonment of morality, but its refinement into something harder and more practical. I need to speak with my sisters, Samuel said, understanding that the true negotiation would take place not with Marcus Vance but with Margaret and Catherine themselves. The conversation that followed, conducted in privacy while the outlaw leadership considered his response, revealed how much his sisters had already changed during their weeks in captivity. They were not the frightened girls he had expected to rescue, but young women who had adapted to their circumstances with a pragmatism that both impressed and disturbed him. Margaret, always the more serious of the two, had spent her time learning about the organization's operations and had concluded that association with the Vance brothers offered opportunities that would never be available in conventional society. "They're not monsters, Samuel," she explained with a maturity that seemed to have aged her years in a matter of weeks. "They're businessmen who operate outside the law because that's where the real opportunities are. Women have more freedom here than they ever could in a respectable town." Catherine, whose mechanical aptitude had made her valuable to the gang's operations, was more direct. "I'm not going back to the ranch to spend my life cooking and cleaning and waiting for some man to decide my future for me. Here, what I can do matters more than what people think I should do." The realization that his sisters were not prisoners waiting for rescue but potential partners evaluating an opportunity forced Samuel to confront assumptions he had not even realized he was carrying. He had assumed that salvation meant returning to the life they had known before, that rescue meant restoration of the status quo that had existed before the attack on their ranch. Instead, he discovered that his sisters had used their captivity to examine that old life and found it wanting. The discussion that continued through the afternoon was not about escape but about transformation. The Vance brothers had offered his sisters the chance to become something more than frontier women whose highest aspiration was marriage to prosperous men and whose greatest achievement would be raising children who would face the same limited choices. In exchange for accepting the moral ambiguity of life outside conventional law, they could develop their talents without the restrictions that respectable society imposed on women. Samuel found himself in the unexpected position of defending a way of life he had already abandoned. His own transformation had been forced by circumstances, but he was beginning to understand that his sister's change had been chosen deliberately. They had evaluated their options with the same cold calculation he had learned to apply to problems of survival, and they had reached conclusions that challenged everything he thought he was fighting to preserve. As evening approached and the time came to provide Marcus Vance with an answer, Samuel Morrison stood at the edge of the canyon looking back toward the badlands he had crossed to reach this place. The man who had begun this journey 3 weeks earlier no longer existed. The comfortable assumptions about right and wrong, about the nature of strength and weakness, about what constituted a life worth living, had been systematically destroyed by the necessities of survival and the requirements of effectiveness. What remained was something harder to define but easier to apply to the practical problems of existence in a world where law was often absent and justice was typically a luxury that only the strong could afford. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has already faced the most dangerous enemy he will ever encounter and emerged victorious. The decision Samuel made that evening was not a surrender to corruption or an abandonment of morality, but a recognition that virtue in a complex world required tools and methods that would have been unnecessary in a simpler one. The Vance brothers were criminals, but they were also pioneers creating new forms of organization in places where traditional authority had never established itself. Working with them would require accepting responsibility for actions that could not be justified by conventional standards, but it would also provide opportunities to influence those actions in directions that served larger purposes. More importantly, it would keep his family together while allowing each of them to develop capacities that would serve them well regardless of what form their future lives might take. Margaret's intelligence and social skills, Catherine's mechanical aptitude, and his own hard-won understanding of how to think strategically under pressure would all be valuable assets in whatever challenges lay ahead. When Samuel provided his answer to Marcus Vance, it was with the understanding that he was not choosing between good and evil but between different forms of effectiveness. The organization he was joining was flawed, but it was also adaptable in ways that more respectable institutions were not. The work he would be doing was morally ambiguous, but it would be consequential in ways that his old life as a rancher had never been. Most importantly, the choice allowed him to honor the commitment that had driven his transformation from the beginning, ensuring that his sisters not only survived but thrived. Their safety would be guaranteed not by his protection but by their own competence, their ability to make themselves valuable to people who thought in terms of practical utility rather than sentimental attachment. The man who had once been Samuel Morrison, timid rancher afraid of his own shadow, was indeed dead. In his place stood someone harder and more capable, someone who understood that strength often wore the mask of weakness and that the most important victories were often won by refusing to fight battles that could not be won while positioning oneself to win battles that mattered more. 6 months later, as Samuel Morrison stood once again at the edge of Redemption Valley, the changes in his circumstances would have been incomprehensible to the man he had been. The Vance Brothers organization had evolved under his influence into something that retained its effectiveness while serving purposes that could be defended on grounds more substantial than simple self-interest. Margaret had become the organization's primary liaison with legitimate business interests, her education and social graces opening doors that would have remained closed to obvious criminals. Catherine had established herself as the territory's most skilled blacksmith and mechanic, her services in demand by everyone from frontier sheriffs to Indian tribal leaders. But the most significant change was in Samuel himself. The weakness that had once defined him had been transformed into a different kind of strength, one based not on the absence of fear but on the willingness to act in spite of it. The moral certainties that had once provided comfort had been replaced by a more complex understanding of what virtue meant in a world where good intentions were insufficient to guarantee good outcomes. The sisters who stood beside him as he surveyed the valley where their parents had died were no longer the frightened girls he had set out to rescue. They were partners in an enterprise that challenged conventional assumptions about law and justice while remaining committed to principles that could be defended on their own merits. The loyalty they showed him was not the gratitude of victims saved from harm, but the respect of equals who had chosen to work together because they shared common values and complementary capabilities. The transformation that had begun with the destruction of everything Samuel Morrison thought he knew about himself had created something unprecedented in the annals of frontier justice, an organization that operated outside the law but remained accountable to standards higher than simple self-interest. The man who had learned to destroy his weak self had discovered that such destruction was not an end in itself but a prerequisite for building something stronger and more enduring. The story that would be told about Samuel Morrison and the sisters who stood by his side would become legend throughout the territories, not because it followed the familiar patterns of frontier heroism but because it demonstrated that strength could emerge from the deliberate embrace of vulnerability, that loyalty could be earned through competence rather than sentiment, and that justice could be served by those who understood that the perfect was often the enemy of the good. In learning to see his own weakness clearly and, without illusion, Samuel Morrison had discovered the foundation for a strength that no external force could destroy. The man who no longer feared his own limitations had become truly dangerous to those who relied on fear and intimidation to maintain their power. The sisters who had chosen transformation over rescue had become partners in an enterprise that would reshape the meaning of justice in a land where traditional law had never fully established itself. The weak man who had stood paralyzed in a burning ranch yard was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that the most profound strength came not from the absence of weakness but from the conscious choice to transform weakness into wisdom, fear into vigilance, and moral certainty into the kind of flexible intelligence that could navigate complex challenges without losing sight of essential principles. Standing together at the edge of Redemption Valley, Samuel Morrison and his sisters represented something new in the American frontier experience. Proof that those who were willing to destroy their weak selves could never be destroyed by others, because they had learned to find strength in places where their enemies would never think to look for it. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, for he has